For those that teach global issues, I think, and are serious about the subject, I think there are really few things that we find more challenging and more daunting than the scope and really the impact of these issues. We're going to talk about what those issues are in just a second. They range from population and weapons of mass destruction and challenges to energy and the environment. We're going to dive into those in just a minute, but first, we need to talk about what they are, and then we're going to offer some examples. They really have four characteristics because, first of all, these issues, this emerging set of challenges from living in such an interdependent world, they are global, but they're not simply because they're global, because they're happening all over the world, and that's something that you really need to have a takeaway here. They're global issues because they transcend all of those boundaries that we talked about earlier and require a collective response. And we're going to talk about here what that means, but there are really four key characteristics of what makes something a global issue. First and foremost, these issues are relatively new. They are certainly somewhere between the last 50, 60 years that we've talked about them in terms of being a global issue. They are experiencing exponential growth, which is a type of growth that even itself can be difficult to get a handle around. They are interdependent, meaning they're linked with one another. And then finally, as I alluded to a second ago, these issues require a collective response if they're to be addressed. No single entity really has the ability to deal with them, much less solve themselves. Well, first of all, these issues are relatively new, and that's an important one to get your head wrapped around. We think of some issues that have age-old and are timeless and have never gone away, and that's certainly history is going to play a big role for here. It always depends upon where you start to tell the story, but they are relatively new. Second of all, these issues are experiencing exponential growth. And if you see by the picture there, that's much different than linear growth, where something stays constant. The best example that we can give is that food production in the world has really has grown linearly, but the populations that are fed off of that food have grown exponentially, and that's a very important concept to grab a hold of. And in order to do that, I think one of the best things to do is really to figure out this story about the lily pad. And the lily pad metaphor was really first made famous by sort of a riddle that used to teach to French school children about the nature of exponential growth, and Lester Brown sort of makes it popular in some of his writings. But the story is this. If you look at one thing about lily pads, or at least in this story, was that there's a lily pond that contains just a single pad, a single leaf, if you will. And each day the number of lily pads doubles. 2 leaves the second day, 4 leaves the third day, 8 leaves the fourth day, and so on. And the challenge is this: on what day, if the pond is going to be full on day 30 in 30 days, the question is, on what day is the pond half full? And one of the things we know about lily pads, if you let them keep growing, they can ultimately overtake the pond. And if the pond is somehow valuable to the health of whatever is being sustained around it, this is why that metaphor was used. The challenge really was not just understanding how lily pads growing exponentially, but the mathematical challenge of thinking linearly in an exponential world. And for many students, coming up with the day, what day is the pond half full? For so many students, they answer 15. 15's halfway to 30. So that's an easy thing to think about it. But if you think about things growing exponentially, the pond is half full on day 29. And we have that slide there in front of you that really shows that. It'll double from day 29 to day 30, 50% being on day 29. But the challenge is, with things that are growing exponentially, that if we wait until that proverbial 29th day, it still looks like we have a lot of time to respond. It took 29 days to get to be 50% full, and it's only going to take one more day to fill it up. But in some cases, the challenge is even more daunting, because if you think about it, it's only 25% full on day 28. Again, if you're looking at an issue that looks like you have a long period of time, but it really does show you what our biggest challenge is it's really the day 26. Because on day 26, the pond's only 6.25% full, and if you want to back it up even one more day, on day 25, it's slightly over 3% full, which looks like we don't even have a problem. And that's one of the things that makes global issues so difficult, because they're growing exponentially, it does look like we don't have a potential problem if we're looking at these things from sort of an aerial view, if we don't factor in the exponential growth part. The third part of what makes something a global issue is that they are interdependent. And these things, when they're interdependent, it means they're linked. And of course, the folks have been exposed at least to that concept before, whereas these balls that are balancing here on these various planks are all dependent upon each other for its stability. But interdependence can be both positively and negatively associated. So, for example, when we're addressing global issues, it might mean that addressing one of these issues also helps make another one better off. For example, if you wanted to sort of address the issue of hunger in the world, fewer hungry people might also help the issue of wealth in terms of and alleviating poverty with the issue of development. You can see how those are sort of interdependent and positively linked. But you could also affect them negatively. For example, the rainforest is sort of in that classic example where, corporations or even governments there may have some interest in using parts of the rainforest to generate wealth, that comparative advantage that might exist there, subsistence farmers clearing them in order to survive. But we may also be destroying, answers to diseases, or certainly the oxygen supply. 20% of the world's oxygen is estimated to come from that area, in which we're all dependent upon that, and the plant and animal species that are there, not to mention the potential pharmaceutical inventions that may come out of all of that area. That's one nature in which you can see that interdependence is negatively linked. So example, solving one, in this case wealth, alleviating poverty on behalf of people that might live there, creates a negative impact on the environment for people living elsewhere. And we'll dive more into those sorts of things throughout the course. In some ways, I've always thought that the most difficult challenge, though, about looking at global issues and what makes it a global issue is really this last one. These issues require a collective response. That's a difficult one, particularly when you think about we're living in a world in which humans historically have had a great difficulty in terms of cooperating. Whether we think about the 150 plus wars that have continued to be fought since the end of World War II and the advent of nuclear weapons have been about, that's just the most glaring example of lack of cooperation, where it's when conflict arises that requires an international response, who's willing to sort of address that issue and who's not. This ability to get a collective response on behalf of, it really does point out the challenge of the actors in the world on behalf of different governments, corporations, organizations, groups, individuals, families, various types of organizations. You've got to have all of those folks to try and deal with that, much less solve them. And that's something we haven't been very good at. And it's part of what makes it, at least from a human standpoint, and a study of things international about why global issues is such a challenging one. And it's understanding these four characteristics that do make up a global issue.